Good day, ladies and gentlemen. I have my friend here, Lloyd Jongh, and we're going to be continuing our talk about evolution's father, the progenitor of modern evolutionary theory. Lloyd will show us throughout the series why it's actually an ancient pagan idea that's basically just been co-opted. But anyway, for intents and purposes, he has seen Darwin, that is, as the progenitor of evolutionary theory in our day, and he was an interesting chap, had a personal life on the level of great heroes of religion such as Muhammad and Martin Luther. And Lloyd's going to bring us through part two. We did part one about 12 days ago. We're back with part two. So you can watch this series, this episode, please do, but there'll be certain parts you want to fill in the blank by watching after. In typical Lloyd de Jongh fashion, he has tons of slides and things like that to help us through it. So anyway, Lloyd, how you doing?
Very well, thank you. Very busy, but glad to be back. Glad to be here with you.
Good. And how's the weather over in Poland? It's extremely hot here.
We had a heat wave a week or two ago. For like 2 weeks, we were really hot, 30 plus, nearly 40-degree weather at points, but it's cooling down now.
Okay.
But it's pleasant. It's really pleasant.
I was telling you before we came on that it's so hot. We don't have air conditioning in my house, and it's so hot that the crayons in the bucket that we have crayons in the sunroom literally melted to each other. I know they were in the sun, but it was like 30 degrees in that room plus the sun. And we also have our driveway being done the next couple days. They're paving it, so if you guys hear rumbling, I'm going to do my best to mute my mic when the machines get too close to the basement. But there's a lot going on here. So anyway, all right, Lloyd. So where did we end off last time with Darwin?
So we ended off with a discussion of the impact, the political impact of Darwin's movement, which was used by people in government and within academia to promote scientific racism and also eugenics, both of which are not a misinterpretation or misapplication of Darwin's ideas, but a direct application of Darwin's own statements.
Yeah. There's a Catholic priest who was a ridiculous heretic and was a terrible priest, Teilhard de Chardin, who maybe you've heard of, but he was a Jesuit. Sadly, one of the bad Jesuits. There were many good ones, but he's one of the bad ones of the 20th century. Anyway, more and more is coming out about him recently because Pope Francis, being the enigmatic pope that he is, tends to say nice things about heretics, which is unfortunate. And so he talked about Teilhard de Chardin. Well, when you look into Teilhard de Chardin's works, you find that he himself was completely racist, and it was because of evolutionary theory. He was in China, and he was doing all this paleontological work in China and talking about the different races, and he's like, well, this is why they do things here in their uncivilized way, because this is part of their race based on the evolutionary theory, blah, 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 blah. So you see this, anyone who adopts evolutionary theory whole hog will undoubtedly get to a position where they face a logical conundrum. If they recognize there are differences that are physical, they must believe that those have some sort of intrinsic effect on the level or the basically the evolved state of whatever creature they're looking at, and that has to apply to human beings. So anyway, I'll share the slides here and we'll get going.
All right. Okay, so this is on my channel. I'm doing this in much more depth because I want to go through it slightly less detail presentation on this channel now, but you can find it to my channel in far more detail. But also here I have the benefit of commentary from Kennedy, so that always helps to have a partner to discuss. Notice here though, you've got eugenical sterilization in the United States, a report of the psychopathic laboratory of the Municipal Court of Chicago. The psychopathic laboratory, you gotta love those words. But understand, Darwin had massive impact in the US. These programs, science, went and sterilized people, went and did medical experiments on people, incarcerated people, aborted children against people's wishes, had people locked up, did medical treatments on them against their will, etc., etc. These are crimes in the name of science, the science that atheism says, well, since religion is bunk, we have science, we believe in science. Science being a process. I don't know how you can believe in a process, but anywho, this science committed crimes, and one day I should do a talk about the crimes of science so we can see just how ethical the religion of atheists is. So, yeah, moving on. I have discussed this already, that atheism atheists have utilized Darwinism as part of their major polemic against religion because it has become like a replacement creation myth for them. And of course, Darwin gave scientific racism the respectability and authority of science, and it dehumanized people. We mentioned Ota Benga, right? This was the pygmy in the zoo, and numerous atheist scientists claimed that this guy was a monkey, right? He was not a real human being, and they refused to see him as a real human being. And without rehashing that, you can watch the previous episode. I just want to mention that there's a case here. There are two cases, for instance. In this case, you have a student that murdered 8 people, including the school's head teacher, in 2007. And he believed that humans had slowed or even reversed evolution in Western society and the weak minded people reproduce. And he wanted to ignite this conversation around how we should get rid of the feeble minded, the people that we consider weak, and promote the intelligence. So he murdered a bunch of people, and he did it in the name of Darwinism, right? And then, of course, you've got, I'll mention here, the Columbine killers with 2 amateur social Darwinists. And in fact, one of the killers was wearing a natural selection t-shirt on the day of the massacre. And both of them had made blunt remarks on video by saying they were helping natural selection along. And then, of course, we have all sorts of conspiracy theories, but these guys were atheist Darwinists.
So
acting in the name of Darwin. Yeah.
This will be I'll play the devil's advocate so we can address these things before people even say them. They'll say, well, listen, that doesn't have anything to do with evolution. That doesn't have anything to do with Islam. Well, here's the thing. It is not true. Lloyd is not saying that everyone who thinks that, Richard Dawkins or Charles Darwin has something nice to say. No, we're not saying that that person will necessarily become a school shooter. No one's being that daft. But the beliefs of evolutionary theory are not in contradiction to these actions, is the point.
Correct.
If a Christian uses Christianity or uses the name of Christianity to do something evil, we actually judge their actions by the religion and say, you're acting in contravention of what your religion teaches. But if somebody says evolution is a thing, natural selection, survival of the species, whatever, all these things, and then says we should probably exterminate a group because they don't demonstrate the characteristics necessary for the flourishing of that species, we may disagree with their methods, but we can't disagree with their reasoning. And that's the point of unpacking why there are such issues with this on a basic philosophical level.
Right. Now, of course, ideas have consequences, and Darwinism has consequences. These ideas are no different to what the Nazis did. Literally no different. They're only different in scale, not different in kind, just in degree. Now, for instance, there's a case here of a woman who, there's a case of a woman who aborted her first 2 children due to the fact that the sonogram of each child showed an extra finger on the child. So the doctor investigated and found that the mother was born with the same condition, and which her mother had dealt with by a very minor operation, and the woman had had no ill effects. There were no medical effects on the woman, but she murdered her children that had the same defect, which she could have remedied with a very simple medical operation. So you see, she chose to kill her first 2 children, and her mother had chosen to let her live. This is the kind of thinking that this Darwinism causes. Their children were not perfect.
Yeah.
So they
well,
had to
of
die.
course. I mean, again, it's not inconsistent. Like, even if you are a theistic evolutionist, like in the sense of there were some deists, there were some general speaking theists of the sort of, the types that were, many of them were American founders, right? That sort of, they believe in the blind watchmaker kind of thing. They weren't atheists. But even if you did believe in a God who was the creator but wasn't a part of the sustenance of creation the way Christians believe it, you don't even have to be an atheist to think like that, because you're not really going to believe in the eternal destination of the soul and judgment and those kinds of things. So this is, again, consistent with the belief of evolution, not just atheistic.
Right. Now, notice, atheists are like, well, atheists don't have beliefs, or whatever. 91% of atheists are Darwinists. Right? Belief in evolution is highest among atheists and agnostics and lowest amongst evangelicals. This is a Pew Research survey. That's the link running over there. All right, so atheists, 91% of atheists are Darwinists. And we're going to look at what the implications of Darwinism obviously are, right? Now, I want to mention something here propaganda. I want to mention atheism. This is from my talk on socialism. This is Lenin in his book Religion. Atheism is a natural and inseparable part of Marxism, of the theory and practice of scientific socialism. The philosophical basis for Marxism is absolutely atheistic and positively hostile to religion. Atheism is an integral part of Marxism, and the Marxist Party must carry on propaganda in favor of atheism. Our program necessarily includes the propaganda of atheism and the publication of the appropriate scientific literature. And he writes at length, there's more quotes that I can throw at you, but do understand that atheism is integral to Marxism. And of course, Marxism is scientific socialism, and they promote scientific atheism because Marxists are scientific atheists. The whole Soviet Union was built on scientific atheism. Now you've got Dawkins and Sham Harris and a whole bunch of atheists that we're scientific atheists. Okay, how are you different to Lenin? How are you different to Stalin in your propaganda? Well, not at all. No different. So what separates you from these tyrants? Nothing whatsoever. Your thought before I go on, Kennedy.
Well, Marxism is evolution. Okay, Marxist theory is of the same philosophical germ, and what I mean by that is like the same kernel,
Marx
the same
was
seed.
deeply inspired by evolution,
Yes, he
by
was.
Darwin. And in fact, at his funeral, Engels gave a speech on evolution and Darwin at Marx's funeral.
Yeah, and it's funny. As I've said before, my first foray into being published as an author and sort of going on YouTube was about the history of evolutionary theory, the traditional doctrine of creation, and the Catholic Church. And I'm blanking on the bishop's name. I think it might have been O'Hare, but he was a Scottish bishop, a Catholic bishop in China at the time of the Cultural Revolution, and he recounted that when the Maoists would go into the different places to start espousing Marxist theory, they would actually start with evolution, and they wouldn't start with communism. And they were very clear, and they said, because if man believes he descends from beasts, he'll basically look at everyone like cattle. And this is necessary for this idea that you can essentially, think about communism for a second. You're looking at society as if it's one organism that essentially has these different parts that either help it or hinder it. And if they hinder it, they have to be cut off, just like a herd, just like culling the herd. It is of the same philosophical basis.
Right. So now let's talk about meet Emma, my Unitarian cousin wife. So now we're going to talk about the woman that Darwin married, his Unitarian cousin wife, Emma. Right. And of course, William Paley of natural theology fame. We won't delve deep into William Paley. I'll cover him another time. But Darwin says, I found it more and more difficult with free scope given to my imagination to invent evidence to basically support this foolish belief in Christianity. Right. He says, disbelief crept over me at a very slow rate, but was at last complete. For those people who want to claim Darwin was a Christian, well, he went to an Anglican seminary. We've already demonstrated he went there because he was useless at university, and he spent his 4 years at seminary drunk and killing small animals. So he was an atheist. His father sent him there because that was where you sent people who were fairly useless. He says, I did not think much about the existence of a personal God until later in my life. But here I will give the vague conclusions to which I have been driven, the old argument from design in nature, which is the Thomas Aquinas argument from design. Okay, as given by Paley, which formerly seemed to me so conclusive, fails, now that the law of natural selection has been discovered. So he discounts theistic evolution, he throws Paley under the bus, he throws Aquinas under the bus, and he says, no, my theory is now the theory.
Yep, that's what you do when you're a humble man of science, just looking for the truth. You're smarter than everyone who's ever lived.
Lord, it's hard to be humble when you're perfect in every way. Yes. Yeah. So now the argument from design has been used for thousands of years. It is most commonly associated in modern times with the 19th century theologian William Paley. His treatise is called Natural Theology, or Evidence of the Existence and Attributes of the Deity Collected from the Appearances of Nature. There's a lot to be said. This is not a William Paley lecture, but we're talking here about, this is Darwin's cousin wife.
He married his cousin?
So his cousin, course he did. The whole family, the incest was the Darwin family thing.
That doesn't seem very
So Darwin,
evolved.
you're just not scientific enough to understand.
Nothing to do with Islam, Lloyd. They don't marry their cousins at all.
So she was a devout anti-Trinitarian Unitarian, and she was very disturbed by Darwin's lack of faith. Right? So you've got more corroboration that the man wasn't a Christian. And lots of people love to say that he was, but I will be peppering various quotes throughout this whole series to demonstrate the man's anti-Christian bent. And she wanted to be with him till beyond death do us part, right? And she knew that her cousin husband had doubts, and she worried that his scientific investigations would deepen them, which they did, because she felt she would be condemned to an eternity alone. And his cousin wife told him this, right? So he says the rate was so slow, the rate at which he lost his belief, that I felt no distress, and I have never since doubted for a second that my conclusion was correct. That's Darwin. I can hardly see how anyone ought to wish Christianity to be true. That's what a true Catholic says, right?
Mm-hmm.
No, Baptists say that. Calvinists, sorry, my bad. Calvinists say that, right? Or, if so, the plain language of the text seems to show that the men who do not believe, and this would include my father, brother, and almost all my best friends, will be everlastingly punished. And this is a damnable doctrine. He's talking here about the problem of evil, and he's saying Christianity is a damnable doctrine. God doesn't come down and punch you in the face. God says, hey, if you drive like a crazy man down this road, you're going to drive off a cliff. Please don't. Make a left at the next intersection. And of course, you decide to drive. Well, those are the consequences. That wasn't punishment. Those were just consequences. You were given an option. So, but that's Darwin's take on this issue. And then finally, on this slide, Darwin says to us in The Descent of Man, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace the savage races throughout the world. Now, one has to ask, who are the savage races and who are the superior races? Well, Darwin does fortunately tell us who the superior races are, the white men of Europe. And the uncivilized savage races are the black people of Africa. So, and they will almost certainly be exterminated. And of course, it was only 14 years later that the extermination started. Your thoughts, Kennedy? But he wasn't a
Yeah,
racist. Don't say that. He was a scientist, big time scientist or something.
it's just absurd. I don't know. Like, I don't know how people do defend this theory. It's. I mean, we're not going too deep into all of the scientific stuff, but there are so many aspects of evolutionary theory just on a basic biological level that have been completely, debunked and just shown to be absurd. The fact that there's just so many ethical consequences. I mean, it really is a complete stain on the entire enterprise of academia that they still prop this man up as if he was some sort of luminary. I mean, they'll look at the Old Testament and they'll find like one story that's hard to understand about how they killed a village or something like that. And they're like, look, Christianity is from the most evil possible thing you could ever imagine. They kill innocent women and children. By the way, don't talk about what Darwin did to the pygmies. It's just absurd.
I know it's hypocrisy of the greatest degree, but yeah, let's continue. Darwin, the Secret Atheist. This is from The Dark Side of Charles Darwin, a critical analysis of an icon of science, right? And Darwin knew that his evolution theory not only supported atheism, but atheism was a logical result of his theory. In fact, it demanded atheism. So he personally discouraged militant arguments against religion because he felt that they have little effect on the public. He wanted a more subtle approach. He didn't feel that being polemical would be helpful. Just basically put it into policy and government, put it into academia, and do it that way. He nevertheless indirectly supported the use of his theory to propagate atheism. That's from Hiram Caton, The Darwin Legend, from the Queensland Institute of Medical Research in 2008. Darwin wrote to atheist Edward Aveling. Now, Edward Aveling is, let me just go to my notes so we know who he is. He is to do with the Marxists, right? So, yeah, Edward Aveling was basically a small-time scientist, but also a socialist, and he translated Marx's Das Kapital, right? Marx's Capital. He was a very strong spokesman for Darwinian evolution, atheism, and of course he was dating Eleanor Marx, Marx's daughter, and of course was a proponent of Darwinism, and of course he was supported by Yeah, by Engels. So nothing to do with socialism at all. Darwin wrote to him, "It appears to me, whether rightly or wrongly, that direct arguments against Christianity and theism produce hardly any effect on the public." So Darwin wanted to undermine Christianity, just not directly. Didn't want to have his face in public. He said, instead of arguing directly, the task of converting people to atheism is best promoted by the gradual illumination of their minds, which will follow from the advance of science, Darwin's science. See, so he was a sneaky little bastard, quite bluntly. It has therefore been always my object to avoid writing on religion for publication, and for this reason I have confined myself to science, but he let other people do his dirty work. And once he said he was with atheists in thought, even though he preferred to call himself an agnostic as opposed to an atheist, in deference to his wife. Now, lots of atheists in the past called themselves agnostics, but they were rabidly anti-Christian, anti-Catholic, anti-biblical agnostics. I mean, violently, rabidly, because they didn't want to call themselves atheists because it had a stigma attached. Your thoughts,
Well,
Kennedy?
who was Darwin's bulldog? What was his name again? Thomas Huxley?
Actually, we'll get to Huxley. Yeah, Huxley was a hypocrite as well. We'll talk about him. Yeah.
Well, he and I don't know if you've ever seen this. You might enjoy this series, Lloyd. It's called Foundations Restored. It's like an 18-part series made by the Kolbe Center for Study of Creation, and it goes through the history of evolutionary philosophy and Darwin and all these kinds of things. It's really, really good. Really, really good. You got to pay for it, but it's worth it. And but Thomas Huxley, they show how in his writings that they wanted to bring down the Catholic Church. Like that was his main thing was he called it like that damnable enemy or something like that. You know, some crazy thing of that monster of the Catholic Church, and he wanted to destroy that. And people always say, you know, evolution doesn't say that you came from monkeys. It doesn't say that you came from apes. You're just being so uncivilized. And like in his actual writings, he's like, when I'm done with them, they will believe they came from an ape. You know, like it's just that's goodness.
Yeah, no, I will. I'm actually busy starting another Darwin series because I've just about finished this one, and I'm going to do another one with the early historical and philosophical development from. It's going to be called Darwin and Democritus because we've got to go back even earlier. So it's not just Lucretius and so on. You've actually got to go back sooner to look at these philosophies. So I've got that coming, yeah. But we'll talk about. Hopefully, we get to the baboon quote where Darwin talks about the baboon quote, and because Darwin, you know, it's crazy how people, yeah, just read Darwin's own writing. I think Darwin can explain Darwin.
You know, we
So
just went to before you continue. We just went to the African lion safari, which is it's in Ontario, Canada, but it's called that, and it's this big nature reserve where they have you can drive through with your car and do a safari, and you drive through the different sections. And we went through the monkey and baboon section, and yeah, you know, I was watching these baboons with their, you know, their bums and their big red bums, and they were walking around and doing monkey things, and I thought, you know, that looks like my cousin there. You know, that's the only explanation is that he must be my cousin.
yeah, no doubt. So let me just fix up my slide. I noticed that I'm always doing. Okay, so Darwin, unfortunately, experienced a great deal of trauma. I'm not going to go through all of it. I deliberately also left it out, but his mother died, and this really affected him. I think he was 8 years old and had a huge psychological impact on him. But there was a lot of death in his family. But then, since they were a family of inbreeders, there was shall we say, an elevated rate of infant death because that's what happened. So now the death of Amy Darwin in childbirth traumatized his son, right? So basically, his son's wife gave birth and she died, and this traumatized his son. So that really affected him as well. He lost 3 of 10 children. Oopsie, my bad. So Darwin suffered severe health issues and depression, and he had a very fragile physical and emotional state. And then his oldest daughter, Annie, died at 10. He was very deeply overcome. That had a huge effect on him. That's his wife here, of course. You know, and this is his daughter, Annie, on this side, right? And then historians tell us that Annie's death changed things extensively, and Darwin became more willing to proclaim his theories and his religious doubts. The death of his daughter. So he tried to justify the death of his daughter, and he started to embrace death as the bringer of life. Death is what brought perfection. Death brought change. Death opened the way for other things to survive and improve. So he turned effectively to believing in death. And I mean, this goes directly against biblical teaching as well. Another one of his biographers says that he really felt her death. And you see him affirming over and over that the circle of life, but it requires death. Things must die. Now, how they die, well, things die, but Darwin also spoke of that the superior races will wipe out the inferior races, presumably with warfare. So Darwin promoted this, right? So yeah, so I'll move on from that. So Darwin is distraught over his mother's death, right? His son's wife dies in childbirth. He sees the impact on his son. 3 of 10 of his children died young. Mary Eleanor lived 23 days. Charles, another son, had Down syndrome and dies at 18 months. He writes to Dr. Asa Gray in 1860, and he writes a very strong objection to theism. He says, I cannot see as plainly as others do, and as I should wish to do, evidence of design and beneficence on all sides of us. There seems to me too much misery in the world. I cannot persuade myself that a loving and beneficent and omnipotent God would have designedly created he speaks here of a caterpillar of a wasp, I think, that lays its eggs in a caterpillar, right? And then they basically breed, and then they eat the animal that they are living in, right? And he says, I cannot see that a loving God would do that. That there is so much suffering in the world, no one disputes. Some have attempted to explain this with reference to man by imagining that it serves for moral improvement. But basically, he goes on and he says, I see so many people suffering with no moral improvement. This very old argument from the existence of suffering against the existence of an intelligent first cause seems to me a strong one. So that's his argument against God in that case.
Yeah. Again, one of the first pieces I published was I basically said how evolutionary theory makes men effeminate. And I had reasons for this. I can't remember them, to be honest. It was so long ago. But basically, there's a determinist. When you look at evolution, you get to basically 2 possible outcomes. On the one hand, you have basically a determinist outcome where it's like it's all happening. There's nothing you can do about it because it's sort of the butterfly effect and it's all just happening. And it's a process.
Well, that is the Darwinist position because he's an atomist.
Exactly. But at the same time,
you're
a human.
He blames God.
Exactly. That's what I'm saying. You're a human being. So you kind of like you think things are unfair. So Darwinism will lead you to Jean-Paul Sartre's philosophical conundrum, where he said the only hard question left in philosophy is why not suicide? Because you get to this position where it's all rigged, like an election, allegedly, and there's nothing you can do about it. And if there's a creator, he's a demon. Like this is all you can really get to with evolutionary theory. And this creates in men the most unvirtuous of characteristics. Obviously, it takes away sin, which means you can fornicate and pornography and abortion, whatever. You can do all the things you want to do. You can steal. You can exterminate race. I mean, you could do literally anything because there is no consequence. And at the same time, you think everything that bad that happens to you is unfair. So you get to become the most objectionable, just weaselly, effeminate human being possible. And it's all justified by evolutionary theory.
Yeah, it's confusing. It's incoherent. But yes, it robs men of hope. And yeah, so let's talk about the inbreeder. Scientific American, Charles Darwin's family tree, tangled with inbreeding and early death. That's Scientific American. Lloyd did not make that up. Right? Charles Darwin's studies of heredity, adaptation, and evolution included many experiments into the effects of crossbreeding. And he said that crossbreeding within the family, keeping it in the family, resulted in weaker, more sickly descendants. Ironically, his own family and marriage may well have been scientific experiments. At 29, he proposed to his cousin, Emma Wedgwood, the daughter of his mother's brother. Darwin realized the dangers of inbreeding and wondered if his close genetic relation had an ill impact on his children's health. 3 of 10 died before the age of 11. In a letter to a friend, Darwin said, "My children are not very robust." So this is not the fittest. Definitely not. His marriage to his cousin was not the only such marriage, incestuous marriage in the family. The Darwin-Wedgwood family had several instances of marriage. An analysis by Tim Berra, professor in the Department of Evolution, Ecology, and blah, blah, blah at Ohio State University, found that Darwin's children did have a moderate level of inbreeding, and in the family's children, there was a significant positive association between child mortality and inbreeding. And of course, Darwin had written consanguineous marriages led to deafness and dumbness, blindness. That he wrote to a parliamentarian, John Lubbock, in 1870. Now, on this point, a family of very sick people. He writes to Dr. Asa Gray, "We are a wretched family and ought to be exterminated." Now, while it wasn't necessarily uncommon, it was definitely very common in his family. So Charles's grandfather, Josiah Wedgwood, set up home with his third cousin, Sarah Wedgwood. Their daughter, Susanna, chose Robert Darwin, Charles's father. Charles's uncle, Emma's father, had 9 offspring, 4 of whom married cousins. Darwin's own marriage had 10 children, and his wife was in her 40s, and Darwin said, "Emma has been very neglectful of late, for we have not had a child for more than 1 whole year." However, the Darwin-Wedgwood family line didn't do so well. Of 62 uncles, cousins, and aunts who descended from Josiah, 38 had no children that survived to adulthood. More than 50% of their children did not survive. Greater than this isn't just because of the era, this is because it was inbreeding and very close inbreeding, and therefore the children died. 6 years after his wife's last child, he started to think about inbreeding, right? And his cousin, of course, had coined the term eugenics, Francis Galton. Now, he'd coined the term. Darwin had created the science of eugenics. And Darwin was anxious about his children. Now, let's listen to this. His 10th and last child, Charles, died while a baby. He was backward in walking and talking, but intelligent and observant, Darwin writes. Henrietta had a digestive illness like her father, who was prone to stress-induced vomiting. Darwin had a huge array of medical problems. And this took her to bed for years. His son Leonard was slow and rather backward. He later married his own cousin and then became president of the Eugenics Society. All his children were involved in eugenics. Horace had attacks many times a day of shuddering, gasping, hysterical sobbing, semi-convulsive movements with much distress of feeling. His daughter Elizabeth had shivers and makes as many extraordinary grimaces as ever. George had an irregular pulse which hinted at some deep flaw in his constitution. So his kids were a little weird.
Well, I mean, it sounds like this family is possessed. Like this is
Doesn't
so.
it just?
It just sounds really bad. It just sounds, yeah. And I mean, so he says his one son is backwards or slow and backward, but then he becomes the president of Eugenics Society. So eugenics is for really, really intelligent people.
All these kids were in the Eugenics Society. Yeah. And I mean, so when he describes his own medical problems, I mean, vomiting and all sorts of problems, the guy had no end of. Martin Luther was the same, you know. So let's look at the evolution of poetry. Darwin is stating what we now call the existential dilemma. Okay. So of course he wants to now say, because there's no God, death is what has brought, the death of the old brings the new, brings the better, brings a greater species, right? Through selection. So this is Darwin's grandfather here, Erasmus. Darwin writes, "There is grandeur in this view of life. From so simple a beginning, endless forms, beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved." So when his daughter dies, this because it makes way for something better, more beautiful, right? And this takes us to Erasmus Darwin, grandfather of Charles, a leading philosopher, naturalist, atheist in the 18th century. He wrote one of the first books on evolution called Zoonomia, or the Laws of Organic Life. Now, where did he get these ideas? Well, from the pagan Greeks, but he believed in species self-improvement through constant adaptation to the environment, and he called it transformism or transmutation. Life consisted of one little thread that connected all things to a common ancestor. Now, you must understand, when we look at the science, it's not like they did analysis, looked at the evidence, came to a conclusion. They had a foregone conclusion. They were trying to fit the evidence to make this particular conclusion seem reasonable. So notice how Erasmus Darwin's poetry prophesied evolutionary theory, because it didn't prophesy. The guy was writing poetry based on pagan Greek ideas. And, well, let's actually have a quick read. Actually, we don't have to read it. It'll be here. Transforming from a... He writes here, "Organic life beneath the shoreless waves was born and nursed in ocean's pearly caves. First forms minute, unseen by spheric glass, moved on the mud or pierced the watery mass. These, as successive generations bloom, new powers acquire and larger limbs assume. Whence countless groups of vegetation spring and breathing realms of blah blah." Sorry, I fell asleep there for a while. And he called that the temple of nature, right? So this was, yeah, let's have a look at, now, this is not the best example, but it's an example, and I could have gone into much greater depth. But I wanted to bring up this idea. This is, you might remember this as Jalaluddin Rumi, the Sufi, the Muslim. I died as mineral and became a plant. I died as plant and rose to animal. I died as animal and I was a man. Why should I fear when I was less by dying? Sorry, when was I less by dying? Once more I shall die as man to soar with angels, but even from angelhood I must pass on. All except God must perish. When I have sacrificed my angel's soul, I shall become what no mind ever conceived. Do you see, oh, let me not exist, for non-existence proclaims in organ tones, to him we shall return. But do you see a sort of a parallel here with this poetry, this philosophical poetry?
Yeah, this is pantheism. I remember I was when I was teaching in this Catholic school. It was extremely liberal. It was a disaster. I tried my best, but it was just banging my head against the wall all the time to try to actually teach the real Catholicism. But I remember in the staff room one time, I found this book, and it was selected writings of I think the Bhagavad Gita. It was one of the Hindu books, and I just opened up to a page. And I had read some of that in university. I took a world religions course that I had to take, part of the prerequisites. And but I was reading it, and it was basically like, who are you? And it's this dialogue between this god and between this person, and it's like, to the demons I am their prince, to the angels I am their king. And I just remember thinking, this is Manichaeism, this is Gnosticism, this is pantheism, this is all the isms, and then you find this in the mystical tradition of Islam. You find this in the diabolical mysticism of evolution. Like, it's all just of the same source.
Yeah. And the Muslims have written extensively on evolution, just like Darwin, but it's all poetry and it's all based eventually. You can trace it back to like 500 BC Greece, right? And it's these pagan Greeks. And this is supposedly the science that Darwin followed. And that's by Rumi, right? So Erasmus Darwin's grandfather was, of course, a Freemason. And let's look at the ancient accepted Scottish rite. So Brother Erasmus Darwin formed the Lunar Society. That's an oddity. Meeting at the full moon. Members were called lunatics. Matthew Bolton was a leading figure. I'm not going to get into the history too deeply. And he says that they were planning to make many motions to the members respecting new laws and regulations such as will tend to prevent the decline of society. In other words, eugenics-based laws, which I hope will be lasting. And then he writes, oddly, this is Bolton, the Empress of Russia is now at my house. That's a very enigmatic phrase that people have been wondering about that for centuries, since 1755. Moving to Derby, England in 1788, he becomes a Mason. And then his kids become Masons. His kids join, his other kid becomes a Mason. They all become Masons. Now, there is no evidence that Darwin himself was a Mason, but there's no evidence saying he wasn't a Mason since everyone around him was a Mason. So Erasmus Darwin had been a Freemason throughout his life, and blah, blah, blah. And his son Reginald was made a Mason, and they've got written records for this, right? Francis Darwin was a Mason, and he wrote there, the three great objects of desire for every organism are lust, hunger, and security. Breaks it down to, well, basically people just want lust, food, and security. That's what drives us. That was his idea. And then finally, Charles Darwin's name does not appear, but it is very possible that he, like Francis, was a Mason. That's a Wikipedia quote. Take it for what you will. Well, your thoughts before I go on.
Sorry, I was muted there. No, that's good. Keep going. This is good stuff. I have nothing to add right now.
Let's look at evolution before Darwin. So in the Darwin family, the menfolk took for granted the self-evident truths of the Enlightenment. And if I do my series on atheism, which you've seen, called The Cult of Reason, then you'll see that the Enlightenment was incredibly anti-Christian, specifically anti-Christian. It was most certainly, undoubtedly atheistic. It was the first atheist government, and it was the most genocidal thing ever. Okay, the first atheist government did not bring reason. These guys immediately started forming cults, right? They formed cults. They were overrun with Freemasons, and not only that, they were extremely occultic, and they were Gnostic. They went insane, right? And they murdered everything in sight. It was atheism or death, right? They murdered how many hundreds of thousands. So that was the Enlightenment, and that's the tradition that Darwin family came out of. Their skepticism towards Christianity included an evolutionary account directed against the biblical doctrine of creation. Darwin absorbed all of this, which had been discussed for centuries, from his grandfather, right? And all of this is traced back to Roman philosopher Lucretius. The idea was significantly formed already before Darwin discovered it. Darwin was a third generation evolutionist. He had read his grandfather's Zoonomia. He studied under the radical evolutionist Robert Grant and the French evolutionist Lamarck, and he would have discussed evolution with him and with his father and his brother, all before setting foot on the Beagle. These ideas were not new. Do you have a thought you wanted to say?
Well, the two things. So, they just found, for example, I don't know if you remember that hysteria about the alleged mass graves, in
Yep,
Canada.
yeah.
It's all
Really
fake.
false, but yeah.
Yeah, all fake. Um, it begs the questions of even just the claims about the schools in general over the years were even true, because if you're willing to lie about something like that, I don't trust you. But in any case, it's like we're at the point now where people are so unbelievably stupid. People are so stupid that they will literally believe that nuns who were like missionaries and literally just wanted to like help the suffering little people have no idea in Canada how bad the lives were for the natives before the settlers got here. Like people have this stupid, they think Pocahontas is history. And actually, if you read the real Pocahontas, it's completely different than the movie. But, she was like actually basically borderline handicapped, and she was given to this old, obese, wifeless guy, not obese, but sickly old guy. And it was not this beautiful love story. It's been completely mythologized. Anyway, when the Canadian martyrs and these Jesuits and these Franciscans and stuff who went through Canada, when they found these people living, like they were living extremely moribund existences, very small rickets, infant mortality, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So all these nuns and things like that went out to start these boarding schools, they were welcomed with open arms, because these Indians, these native peoples were like, first of all, yes, we'd like to save our soul. That sounds like a good idea. Secondly, this idea of having three square meals a day, and my children don't have to grow up to become, polar bear hunters. That would probably be a good way to live. But people are so dumb today that they're willing to believe that nuns were running a Hitler-esque concentration camp, throwing dead children into a hole in the ground, and it was just kept secret for 100 years. But they think they're so stupid that they think that Darwin visited an island and had this magical conversion experience, and because of this inspiration from nature, came up with this beautiful theory of evolution. People are, it just made me think how unbelievably philosophically and historically bereft the average person is today,
Yeah.
and it's maddening.
Yeah. No, evolution was already a fleshed out idea, a pagan Greek idea, and also very much a Muslim idea. And so it was in the culture long before Charles Darwin went in search of evidence to support it, right? So it was a particular philosophical and cultural inheritance, an atheistic cultural inheritance that championed the Whig history, at least within the English context, of rational secular progress over irrational religious superstition. That's all he was doing. Charles Darwin's account of religion as irrational, based in ignorance and fear, in The Descent of Man was thoroughly hashed out during the 17th and 18th centuries. It was nothing new. He was simply trying to give scientific credence to these ideas, right? And a revival of ancient Greek and Roman pagan philosophical views that downgraded all religion to superstition. And these views were revived by the Enlightenment and used directly against Christianity. Right, now, here's the coat of arms and crest of the Darwin families, of members of the Darwin family. Erasmus Darwin added an evolutionary decoration to the family coat of arms, 3 scallop shells on the motto, E Conscious Omnia, all things out of shells. Cryptic Latin of his belief that life evolved from a common ancestor. We all come from shells, apparently. Okay? Charles's father Robert adopted E Conscious Omnia in the 1790s as his own motto, displaying it on his bookplate. Robert, though, kept his views private. He had no wish to be notorious, to be thought of as an atheist. It was unfashionable, okay, back in the day. A man called the Reverend Seward, the father of Erasmus's biographer to be, Anna Seward, saw the motto and accused Erasmus of being a modern Epicurus. This is one of the philosophers that atheists, of course, appeal to as an authority for their beliefs. And it's a significant charge since it meant being a hedonist and atheist as well as an evolutionist. So this discovery brought Erasmus to hide away his views for another 2 decades before publishing Zoonomia in 1794. Thomas Seward, who was canon of nearby Lichfield Cathedral, noticed it and accused Erasmus of having renounced his creator. And he wrote a satirical poem about Erasmus Darwin, part of which read, Great wizard he, by magic spells, can all things raise from cockle shells. Which is just a really odd phrase, great wizard he. I wonder if there's something implied by that. That just makes me wonder, by magic spells. So that's my thought on that. So understand the whole family tradition was atheistic. The whole family wanted to promote these pagan Greek ideas. They were in that camp and they wanted to somehow find a way to make this the supreme idea. Darwin says the first cause is not God. Would it be too bold to imagine that in the great length of time since the earth began to exist, perhaps millions of ages before the commencement of the history of mankind, would it be too bold to imagine that all warm-blooded animals have arisen from one living filament, which the great first cause endued with animality? You know, when you read this sounds like Carl Sagan. This could be Carl Sagan talking about cosmos. With the power of acquiring new parts attended with new propensities, directed by irritations, sensations, volitions, and associations, and thus possessing the faculty of continuing to improve by its own inherent activity. In other words, a rock rolling downhill hits other rocks, gathers a little bit of moss, maybe, who knows, slams into some poo, and all of these things combining together form intelligence and life. And then the thing suddenly gets an arm because it's whacked into a tree trunk that sticks in the rock, and there you go, humans. So, and of delivering down those improvements by generation to its posterity, world without end. Very religious phrasal structure. And very, also when Carl Pagan chose the word cosmos, he chose it for a reason, because cosmos means the pagan world, the naturalistic world. But that's Erasmus Darwin. And notice, he had written about this in pagan poetry. So this was, your thoughts before I go on.
Well, that ending sounds like a doxology, you know.
Yeah.
All glory be to the Father, Son, the Holy Ghost, as it was in the beginning. You know, it's like world without end. Amen. And it's the same. I mean, it's the same. Yeah. But you know, you mentioned how this theory had been talked about philosophically many years prior in antiquity and all these kinds of things. This theory of the descent of life or the creation of life was rejected by the Christian fathers for basic philosophical reasons. It was considered, like, you know, obviously if God is all powerful, then God can do anything he wants. You know, we believe that obviously God doesn't contradict his own existence. He doesn't be and not be at the same time. But so these ideas were rejected long before Thomism, but for reasons of sound Hellenistic philosophy. So it comes down to forms and essences. Essentially, Lloyd and I are both human beings, and we both have the form that is the human being. Okay, so that's the form of human. It's like imagine a stencil. You can only make one thing out of that. And then we have the essence, which is the beingness of who we are, essentially. And it's always been understood in basic philosophy that you can't give what you don't have. There's no sufficient causality or sufficient reason or sufficient causality or efficient, whatever the technical term, I'm forgetting it. But the point is if you're a human being, you can only give life to other things of the same form that will have the same essence. You can't give life to something that's not you. So, obviously, dogs can adapt to certain circumstances. You know, you have when they bring hogs over to North America, they grow longer tusks and blah, blah, blah in these parts and those parts. But they still breed with other hogs, okay? Dogs, even though physiologically you can't get a Newfoundlander, which is like a 5.5-foot dog, to breed with a Chihuahua, but you could technically artificially inseminate a Chihuahua with a Newfoundlander because they are of the same species. It might be a disaster because there's so many differences in them by way of adaptation, but they're still the same species. Even with the equines, you know, the donkeys and the zebras and the horses and things, even though it's rare, there are Z-donks. You know, you can have zebras and donkeys. They're usually infertile and things like that. They're kind of like Darwin's family. You know, you have mules, which are a combination of a horse and a donkey. They're still related in the same thing, but you can't breed a donkey with a deer. It's never going to happen. Okay, you can't breed a horse with a lion. Okay, these forms and these essences can't give rise to other forms and essences. It's just impossible. It's never been observed. It's philosophically absurd, and the unlimited amount of time is never going to make it happen. And I don't understand why Catholics, especially Thomists, look at such basic philosophical information and come up with the stupidest of theories, especially considering it's never happened. It'd be one thing if we could observe it. It'd be one thing if, like, I'm sorry to go on so long here, but I had this, there was a former colleague of mine who was so obsessed with proving evolution to me as a Catholic that he literally made fake social media accounts to stalk me after I had to block him. And this is while I was working with him. He was a coordinator in my school board for curriculum. These are the type of people who are in charge of Catholic education in Ontario. And we had like a 3.5-hour conversation in a pub one night. He said, I just want to have a conversation. Okay, fine. He tried to tell me that we have observed evolutionary theory because he said this is what happened. They took a group of mice and they split that group of mice, and then they basically bred them for many generations, and then like descendant number 50 or whatever couldn't breed with descendant number 50 of the other one. And he said, look, that's proof that it's a new species. I said, first of all, how much have you had to drink? Second of all, that's just proof you inbred the living tar out of this group, this tiny group of families, and they have problems breeding with other. This is how far they will go to say this is a new species. No, they're both mice. They just can't breed with each other because you messed them up through inbreeding. And
scientists have been breeding bacteria that die within hours, and they've done thousands and thousands of generations of that.
Thousands. Like, when we have mutations in human beings, it's very sad. It never creates anything good. It's very sad. So it'd be one thing if we could observe, if we could actually say, aha, I went to the zoo and the monkey gave birth to a non-monkey. Well, that'd be interesting. And then we'd say, well, clearly this is possible. We're going to have to look at philosophy through this lens. But it isn't possible. It's never been observed, and it's philosophically absurd. Catholics need to stop with this nonsense. Anyway, rant over.
Right. So this is the coat of arms of Darwin. I know, before you ask me, this is the Darwin coat of arms from the 1970s. Darwin, the city in Australia. Not the man, Darwin. You're very welcome. But just thought that was fascinating. Yeah. Okay. Epicurus and Lucretius. Let's have a quick look at those guys. So Matthew Arnold, well-known poet and educator, says, I cannot understand why you scientific people make such a fuss about Darwin. Why? It's all in Lucretius. So Darwin is just regurgitating Lucretius, the philosopher, right? Pagan materialist Epicurus and Roman follower Lucretius. They said that the entire mystery of the world was found on different shapes and objects generated at random, atomism, by chance interaction of atoms. Life and mind, the unsubstantiated claim went, originated as emergent properties of atoms smashing into each other. So these configurations, these things smashing into each other, just became more complex, and Bob's your uncle. You have atomism. I will cover atomism separately in another series, but Epicurus is pictured with his other disciple here. So this is Epicurus here, and this is Epicurus's disciple, Carl Pagan. This is Carl Pagan right here. We'll talk more about Carl Pagan later, but nature had evolved spontaneously, they claim, magically, which is exactly what we've seen other atheist philosophers claim, that the universe came from nothing, just nothing, except there was something in the nothing, and they redefined the word nothing, they redefined something, and just give us one free miracle and we'll explain all the rest. And these things then evolve into more complex combinations, and then plants and animals evolve via trial and error. And Darwin called this natural selection. He just gave a nice name to basically this paganism. Epicurus said that nature was an aggregate of material entities operated by blind and unvarying natural laws. In other words, it's Darwinism back in the day. For Lucretius, the gods did not exist, but inhabited a separate. He was a deist, effectively. The gods went off and disappeared. Like de Sade, Marquis de Sade, Epicurus is known for his teachings on pleasure. Atomism was not neutral science to an unbiased philosophical perspective, and Darwin was an atomist. It was activism, psychological therapy. Athenian fellow citizens he deemed oppressed by cosmic forces, of which the gods were the personifications, and this atomism was a way to free them of the curse, the scourge of the gods. I just got to fix the word citizens here. There we go.
So Epicurus. So this is the same Epicurus from whence we get Epicurean philosophy, which is all about the types of pleasures you should have. Okay. So it's funny. I didn't even know this when I wrote that article. I knew about Lucretius, but I didn't know about Epicurus inspiring Lucretius. I didn't know Epicurus was essentially, one of the philosophical fathers of evolutionary theory when I wrote that article about how evolutionary theory leads to effeminacy, which is and effeminacy is a reluctance to suffer due to an attachment to pleasure. That's what the definition is. So it just shows. I mean, if it just shows all of these, I didn't even know that. And one of my first articles was evolutionary theory leads you to being a pleasure seeker. And now I'm being vindicated by Lloyd, and that's awesome. That's interesting.
Oh, wait till we get to Marquis de Sade, because Marquis de Sade, and who was, I mean, it's Marquis de Sade was the word sadism and the word sadist are derivative from his name, and he was an atheist. An atheist going to go, well, no, he was the wrong kind of atheist. He wasn't like me, and yeah, that's where we get the term sadism and sadist from. And he was very much in line with Darwin. Marquis de Sade's philosophy and Darwin's philosophy are no different. Lucretius, de rerum natura. So Darwin's idea had been expressed through the early 19th century by James Pritchard, William Wells, and various others, all right? And then there was an anonymous author at the time of a book called Vestiges, right? And the theory of evolution was around in the first century BC and well before that too. The Epicurean philosopher Lucretius provided atheists with a full-blown evolutionary account mapping out stage by stage how random atoms bumping together produced everything in the universe up to man. So a creation myth without God, right? Lucretius was the darling of the 18th century philosophers. That's the French Revolution and the Enlightenment. So he gave deists and atheists with a secular response to he provided them with a secular response to the Christian scheme of creation and salvation. So European intelligentsia had been well aware of this thought for more than a century. But when you look at through history to certain people, it had been around for a couple of thousand years. So Lucretius also wrote a poem to explain the tenets of Epicurean philosophy, and he called it On the Nature of the Universe. And Darwin's grandfather had written a poem on the Temple of Nature, and this is all just poetry. They saw themselves in the same mold as these poets, as these philosophers. Lucretius subverts the norms of epic, yet there's a quest and an epic hero, Epicurus, who has revealed to mankind the secret of life, and the secret of life is not to worry about death. And that's why Darwin was writing about death being this beautiful, wonderful thing. And he goes here, Darwin's debt to Lucretius of the nature of things, de rerum natura, is relatively well known. He signals Lucretius's presence within the poem through a second address. So this is obviously Erasmus Darwin. This is a paper on it. And Lucretius' address to Venus at the beginning. So in other words, he's stolen things from these poets, right? And included it. Now, from one Darwin to another, the journal Nature, which I guess is quite prestigious, Charles Darwin's annotations to Erasmus Darwin's The Temple of Nature. It has been said often that ideas on the transformation of species found in the work of Erasmus Darwin inspired his grandson's theory of evolution. Based on an examination of Charles Darwin's own copy of The Temple of Nature, there are 25 markings that Charles Darwin made in the book as evidence of his interest in and familiarity with Erasmus Darwin's ideas, which contradicts statements made before, reporting only 2 annotations. So in other words, atheists and scientists were wanting to minimize the fact that Darwin was getting ideas from his grandfather. And it turns out that they'd underreported the number of annotations. Charles Darwin's annotations indicate that he and his grandfather's interest in the competition for reproduction and point to a more remarkable resemblance between Erasmus Darwin's The Temple of Nature and Charles Darwin's The Descent of Man, rather than to Charles Darwin's theory of evolution by means of natural selection. So Darwin was copying basically pagan poetry, shall we say. Your thoughts before I go on?
Nothing to do with Islam, Lloyd. Just
Never.
because Darwin is saying the exact same thing as the pagans, just because it has nothing to do with science, just because it's not observable in nature, just because it can't be validated by philosophy, it has no bearing on whether or not it's true. And if you don't believe it, you're just a fundamentalist.
Yeah. No, I've not been triggered by the live chat because I've been staying out of the live chat. Someone just asked the question. So I've been staying out of the chat. Okay, so basically, I mean, would we take Lucretius and go, yeah, that's science? No, we wouldn't. But Charles Darwin is saying the same thing with a few more flowery words. We're going, yeah, that's science. Like, sure. Philosophical speculation about the origin and development of the world goes back to the Greek Anaximander, that we're talking 600 years BC, right? And to Anaximenes, who thought that the earth was muddy and that out of this primordial slime came plants, animals, and then human beings. Doesn't that sound Darwinian? This is just more pagan nonsense.
Well, it just shows you like if you look at some translations of Genesis, they'll talk about the slime of the earth or whatever, but it's God forms man. So there's no. It's clear that Revelation. It's clear that Revelation is saying to us that God makes man in His own image out of the stuff of the earth. So we have the
Yeah.
stuff. We are of the stuff. We're obviously a creature, so we are part of the creation. But also too, there's wisdom in the fact that it's out of the dust, or out of the mud, or out of the soil, or out of the slime, because it's clear that God is taking, and Thomas Aquinas talks about this with sort of the nature of matter, the nature of the first matter that's used, whether it has a form or an essence, or whatever. It's debated. But the point is God takes something and does to it what only God can. It can't happen without Him, and this is denied by these theories.
Yeah. So next thing Darwin's sorry, next thing we find is that of course this guy's telling us partly aquatic humans subsequently moved on to land. That this all sounds suddenly very familiar. Like yeah, we came out of the ocean, moved on to land, then we lost our gills, and then you've got philosophers Empedocles, Democritus. We need to talk about Democritus, Epicurus, and Lucretius. Life is not a divine creation, but an emanation of the natural flux. Emanation is a Gnostic term from Albert, the monad. Albert is not a creative soul. Albert is just something that just like a bee, like a in a beehive. You got the queen bee. She just pops out babies. That's what Albert does. And Empedocles addressed the problem of the world's complexity by saying that the flux tossed up all sorts of different shapes and objects generated at random by the chance interaction of elements. Now, that sounds stupid when you realize this is 2,500 years ago, but literally, atheist scientists are saying the exact same thing today, but it's science. So, yeah. And of course, this goes back to the Darwin family. It goes back well before to 2,600, 2,600 years ago. Carl Pagan and the birth of Carl Paganism. The inspiration for Lucretius' poem was a philosophical work, The Art of Happiness, by Epicurus from he lived about 270 BC. The universe is mindless, without a creator, purposeless and non-intelligent, colliding atoms with no cosmic source of direction. Okay, this is definitely pagan atheism. There is no end of purpose to existence. Life is ceaseless mutation, creation, and destruction, governed by chance. Plants and animals evolved via trial and error from random processes over a long time. All species emerged, animal and human. In some cases, the random process was unsuccessful. And of course, those species died out. And then, in contradistinction to perfectly formed creatures able to adapt and reproduce, nothing is a divine gift. Earth was not made for us. Human characteristics are imitations of lower animals. Humans are part of the material process, which links them to organic matter, the animal world, and the stars in the sky. And if you listen to Carl Sagan speaking in Cosmos, he's basically quoting the same stuff. Son, would you agree with that, Kennedy?
Yes, I
Yeah.
would.
So that's the view.
But before I was practicing Catholic, I was like I listened to a lot of Joe Rogan and stuff, and I remember getting into like Neil deGrasse Tyson and kind of looking into those guys, and I remember just getting to a point where I was like, this is weird. Like you guys are just this is like a religion to you, you know? It just is. I mean, it's just pagan naturalism.
So would we credit these philosophers from 2,500 years ago? Would we credit them as having discovered the absolute pinnacle of science? Of course not. We'd say they're primitive pagans. But literally, top scientists in the world today are saying exactly the same words. Yeah, no, that's science. Nobel Prize for these guys. So atheists, of course, like this stuff. Human origins did not occur in paradise, but in a primitive battle for survival, struggling to eat and to avoid being eaten. That's the claim, right? There's no soul, no afterlife. There's no hell. There's no heaven. Religion is a fantasy that is violent and cruel. Now, Neil Gillespie wrote a book called, you see, Charles Darwin and the Problem of Creation. And he writes, Darwin's vision of a masterless and undesigned nature brought with it hints of ancient atomism and its attendant atheism, but also this implication of violence, the struggle, survival for the fittest. And you've got this science in the Journal of Science, Darwin's Theology, Charles Darwin and the Problem of Creation. That's interesting. The journal Science is saying that, is calling this Darwin's theology. Isn't that odd? It is a theology. The reason there is so much theology in the origin is that theological issues were alive ones for Darwin, and the special creation was a living and powerful idea among his colleagues. Most of the scientists of the day were believed in creation and believed in theistic evolution, and he had to attack it with whatever weapons would be effective, including ridicule. Theological issues were important for Darwin. He attacked on theological as well as a scientific front. Darwin was anti-Christian and intended to destroy the Christian faith. That was his agenda, not science. So he worked to legitimize ancient paganism and poetry as science. Yeah. I'll just run on. So, of course, Darwin believed that bears would turn into whales because bears were running around in the water with their mouths wide open, eating little fishies and whatnot. And he said that, well, over time, the mouth would get bigger and bigger and bigger. And as the mouth would get bigger, they'd catch more food, and then the animal would get bigger because it had more food. And he says, yeah, I see no difficulty in a race of bears being rendered by natural selection more and more aquatic in their structure, with larger and larger mouths till a creature was produced as monstrous as a whale. Now, he put that in the first edition of On the Origin of Species. Of course, he was laughed at for that, right? The bear case, he said to a friend, has been well laughed at. Now, Darwin then removed it from the book, but privately, he still believed it. He still privately believed that bears could change into other animals. That has never been seen. Because actually, hold it. Oh my God, this was a pencil sharpener 20 minutes ago. What the heck? What the heck? So yeah.
It's
Um,
so
I
Lloyd.
mean,
It's so stupid. Like, you know, anyone who thinks like just for a second, people just think about the camel. The lungfish is the most damning creature against evolutionary theory, by the way, because it basically like becomes mud. It doesn't actually, but it like has one heartbeat every 6 months or something like that, and then rehydrates. And like the way that like if survival of the fittest, if if uh, if this idea of natural selection, so basically you adapt to your environments, and if you don't, you die. If this is the thing, please explain to me the camel. Think about this for a second. Like,
yeah,
if a human being goes like 7 days without water, he dies. I don't know what it is for animals. It's probably pretty similar, okay, generally speaking. So, what on earth is happening here, ladies and gentlemen? For like 100,000 years, however many years it takes, because you make it up as you go along, because it's all just pagan religion anyway. Basically, the mommy camel or the daddy camel is like, you know what, guys, we're gonna go and we're in this desert. And instead of leaving this area we can't survive in, like all other animals that have ever been observed, and going somewhere we can survive, we're going to stay here because we have choice, apparently. And we're going to just venture out as far as we can without water, and we're going to just go till we're almost dead. And then we're going to walk home, and we're going to get some water, and we're going to drink a lot of it. And then we're going to keep doing that for 100,000 years until we finally get to the point where we develop these humps on our backs that we can fill with water that just so happen to be perfect for people to ride on. And we're just going to do that over and over and over again until we develop this ability to adapt to the surroundings so that we can go without water. None of it makes any sense. It's so unbelievably stupid, and people laugh at
yeah.
you when you say monkey to man or whatever. Listen, Darwin's literally saying that bears, they get so much water in their mouth that it stretches out their jowls, and then over time, somehow he develops the ability to breathe underwater, because that clearly follows. Obviously, going to the water by the bear, he's just sitting there, he's lapping up fish like Winnie the Pooh, brings up some honey, and then he starts to swim. I mean, there's no other explanation.
Well, I started playing 144p videos on my phone, and I can tell you my screen was half the size, but as I moved up to 720p, 1080p, my phone got bigger. Next, I'm going to play 4K videos on my phone, and it's going to grow to the size of a 50-inch television. All you know. Just wait.
And you
So,
can't.
adaptation.
That's facts, right? That you can't debate
So,
it.
Smithsonian Magazine tells us about what Darwin didn't know. Today's scientists marvel that the 19th century naturalist's grand vision of evolution is still the key to life. Yeah, it's the key to life. Great. So it's not unimportant. Transformism and transmutation, right? From his family, those are the terms. Charles Darwin was 28 years old when in 1837 he scribbled in a notebook, one species does change into another. Just in case anyone says Darwin never made that claim, he did. E.O. Wilson tells us Darwin focused on how one species was transformed by some force mumbo jumbo, blah blah blah, yada yada, abracadabra, into another species through time. Okay, you can change your. Oh my god, yeah, you can transform. You can transform, right? Right, Kennedy. It is possible to transform.
I wish I
You
was
can
blind. I wish I
trans.
was. Maybe I'll evolve into a blind man because I'd like to be blind.
I mean, even Baphomet here is a little bit trans, okay? Because this is a scientific word. You learn this in college. It's called boobies. This is Baphomet with his little staff over here, his little stick shift, and the boobies, you see? So, just so you know, and yeah, so moving on. Right. Christian Linnaeus, okay? Charles Darwin remarks that he's got two gods. In 1882, Darwin writes, look, he's got two gods, great scientists that he admires, the botanist Linnaeus and zoologist Cuvier. But he says they are mere schoolboys to old Aristotle, so he admires these three people. Linnaeus founded systematic botany, except he believed in creation. He was a devout Christian. The observer of nature sees with admiration that the whole world is full of the glory of God. God, infinite, omniscient, and omnipotent, woke me up and I was amazed. Even in the smallest things and the most minute, how much wisdom, what an inscrutable perfection. And Erasmus Darwin even used Linnaeus' classification system in his poem, The Botanic Garden, in 1789. So Darwin admired these guys as scientific gods. These guys believed in creation and God, but Darwin was like, yeah, not that stuff. I have seen the eternal, infinite, omniscient God pass close by, and I knelt prostrate in adoration. Then Cuvier. This is from the University of California, Berkeley Museum of Paleontology, writing about, without a doubt, Cuvier possessed one of the finest minds in history. He almost single-handedly founded vertebrate paleontology as a scientific discipline and blah blah. Cuvier firmly established the fact of the extinction of past life forms. Highly regarded, okay, scientist. And so a Lutheran, he believed that living things were created through the special intervention of God rather than evolution. So Darwin was surrounded by scientists who believed very strongly that they saw the signature of God in nature. And yet Darwin rejected all of this, even though he took their science. He used their science. He believed in their science, but he rejected their theology. Okay. Then Aristotle. Let's finish with Aristotle. The chain of being. Aristotle had a hierarchical arrangement of natural forms termed the scala naturae, or chain of being. And he examined the natural world for evidence of a divine order. Now, of course, he's pagan, but he believed in the gods. Species were arranged in a linear fashion on a scale, God to man, to mammals, to egg-laying animals, to insects, to plants, and non-living matter. So Aristotle's ideas formed the basis for the Western belief of a fixity of species, and Darwin obviously wanted a non-fixity of species, right? And these things have form, a fixed form. So Darwin discarded all the supernatural, and Aristotle's ideas entered into Christian medieval theology, especially with Aquinas but prior to Aquinas, but certainly with Aquinas, they took many of his ideas and tried to rework them, as they would say, baptize them into the Christian faith. So, and all that remained was, according to Darwin, the material universe. Authority was given to Darwinian science as the only true source of knowledge. And morality, in Darwin's terms, was reduced to one law only, the survival of the fittest. So all of these people he appealed to believed in God, believed in nature as a construction of gods. And Darwin rejected all of that, so he didn't want anything to do with God. He definitely was anti-God. Your thought before I go on?
I was one time listening to a talk by a guy talking about conversion or something like that, some testimony. And he told a story about how when he was in university, he worked at a restaurant, and he had a colleague who was an atheist. So he would make fun of him. So when they would go wait in the line for drinks or whatever at the bar, he would just bump in front of him and get him out of the way. He'd be like, "Survival of the fittest, buddy. Like, get out of here." He's like, "That's not how it works." And he's like, "That's exactly how it works." Eventually, the guy ended up converting to Christianity. But yeah, that's the logic of it.
So George Mivart, a Catholic. So George Jackson Mivart, devout Roman Catholic, did work in evolutionary biology, and he criticized Darwin's theory. He disagreed, and he argued for the existence of an inherent purpose or design in nature, right? So Mivart argued that natural selection could not produce structures as complex as the vertebrate eye, and so on. Asa Gray was a devout Christian. He believed in the compatibility of science and religion. These were top scientists of Darwin's day, right? All of them were natural theists. or at least theological naturalists. He saw the study of nature as a way to understand and appreciate God's work. And then Charles Lyell, raised in a Christian family, and he believed in a form of deism, but basically he said that, look, there seems to be order in nature, right? Now, Darwin, let's talk about Darwin and incest and conscience. So Darwin rejected the whole Christian tradition. Darwin was definitely, did I do something? Is there something that I should know about, Kennedy?
Yeah, I think he was drinking a chocolate milk and it got on his mustache.
Oh my, oh yeah, no, I'm not definitely not trying to say anything with that mustache. Definitely not. So, Darwin says, we may therefore reject the belief, lately insisted on by some writers, that the abhorrence of incest is due to our possessing a special God implanted conscience. See, incest, whether you want it or don't want it, like it or don't like it, that's just preference. That's just whatever's beneficial to the society at the time in that place. See, it's not like we're against, because it's not like Darwin's family weren't incest sort of lovers, right? No, 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 no. Wouldn't want to justify that stuff. How so many strange superstitions have arisen throughout the world, we know not. It's a superstition to disregard, to reject incest. It's superstitious. Nor can we tell how some real and great crimes, such as incest, have come to be held in abhorrence, which is not universal by the lowest savages. It is even doubtful whether in some tribes incest would be looked on with a greater horror than would, say, the marriage of a man with a woman bearing the same name, though not even related to him. So, so he's saying, well, it's relative to, because he goes on at length about this, but just the quote's so interesting. To violate this law is a crime which the Australians hold in greatest abhorrence. You are less committing a crime than sleeping with your family, your sister, than you are if you marry a woman with the same name from a different tribe. You can't do that. That's considered. And this agreeing exactly with certain tribes of North America. When the question is put in either district, is it worse to kill a girl of a foreign tribe or to marry a girl of one's own? An answer opposite to ours would be given without hesitation. They're saying, no, 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 it's okay to kill foreign people and whatever. Well, it's okay. Yeah, you can do that. That's fine. So he's saying that these guys have a different, but he doesn't argue that he doesn't provide a, shall we say, he's got relative morals operating here. Your thoughts on this before I go on?
Well, back when I was a teacher, one of the things I got in trouble for was someone on Twitter posted something about how various homosexual activities were seen amongst some animal. And they were trying to prove that this was, proof that homosexuality was natural. And I replied, yes. They also found that chimpanzees throw their feces and eat babies. So this must also be natural.
That's natural.
And, I was told I was insensitive or whatever. And I said, listen, I'm not saying that, like, eating babies, I'm not, like, you're missing the point here. The point is you're saying this is found in animals, therefore this must be normal. It's like, well, we could say that about lots of stuff. Eating vomit. Dogs eat their vomit. Well, this is natural. I mean, the dogs eat their vomit. Some animals do homosexual things.
Yeah.
Some animals eat their babies. I mean, it's all good. It's all good. We can just accept it all. And this is the same argument. It's like, well, this primitive group over here do something that, they cannibalize. So cannibalism must be good. It's like, this isn't even an argument. This is just you observe something and say that must represent all things. It's just stupid.
Yeah. So in Darwinian evolution, and this is from Benjamin Weicker, speaking of the Darwin myth, but there is no morality in Darwinian evolution. There are moralities. The only criterion is success in the struggle to survive, quite literally, because Darwin has rejected morality. Human moralities are a result of natural selection, defined by the qualities or traits that enable a particular group to survive in a particular place. That's it. It's fully subjective. If we can kill our neighbors and take their stuff and we survive and they don't, well, that's moral. It's moral. So there's no right and wrong among moralities. There's only good and bad, but no good and no evil. If it contributes to the overall survival, then that is fine. And he says here, it could also mean that, so in other words, it can mean increased savagery towards other tribes, or it could also mean increased savagery within your own tribe. Or it could mean that you abolish slavery, or it means you reinstitute slavery. It could mean vegetarianism or cannibalism. So Darwinism launched the eugenics movement. And natural selection as affecting civilized nations. Charles Darwin's right. I've hitherto only considered the advancement of man from a semi-human condition to that of the modern savage. We civilized men do our utmost to check the process of elimination. We build asylums for the imbecile, the maimed, and the sick. We have laws to help the poor, and our medical men exert their utmost to save the lives of everyone. There's reason to believe that vaccination has preserved thousands who, from a weak constitution, would have died. The weak members of civilized society propagate their kind. Hitler said the very same. No one who has attended to the breeding of domestic animals will doubt that this injures the animals, therefore it injures the race of man. It leads to degeneration of the domestic race, but accepting it in the case of man himself, hardly anyone is so ignorant as to allow his worst animals to breed. Darwin is saying we're allowing our worst animals to breed. The Nazis said this, and the Nazis took action on it. You understand? This is Darwin in his own words. The implications here are very clear. Darwin was a eugenicist, and Darwin recommended culling the weak. And who decides who's weak? Well, Darwin was a sickly little bugger. His whole family was sickly little inbred buggers. So,
Yeah, it's
yeah.
just it's absurd.
So Darwin letter reveals, I do not believe in the Bible. That's the letter here. Okay. And there was a guy who asked him, Darwin's letter to a young barrister named Francis McDermott, November 23, 1880, says, if I am to have the pleasure in reading your books, I must feel that I shall not, at the end, have lost my faith in the New Testament. I write therefore to ask, give me a yes or no. Do you believe in the New Testament? And he promises he won't reveal the answer. And Darwin writes back, Dear Sir, I am sorry to have to inform you that I do not believe in the Bible as a divine revelation, and therefore not in Jesus Christ as the Son of God. Yours faithfully, Charles Darwin. And he says, it has always been my object to avoid writing on religion, and I've confined myself to science. He rejects religion, so he does not believe in the Bible as a divine revelation. He goes on to say in other passages, this is about as realistic as a fairy tale, as the Bhagavad Gita. It's on the same par as any other. So that's Darwin. He's definitely not Christian. So
Didn't Dawkins say he was Christian? Oh, they said Hitler was a Christian.
I have a whole series on that,
Yeah.
which disproves that there is no evidence for that.
Yeah.
He was until maybe 18, but then obviously he was never committed Christian. He was never someone who followed the Christian doctrine.
Yeah.
But yeah, so in Wiley Online Library, the Annie hypothesis, did the death of his daughter cause Darwin to give up Christianity? It's a well-known question. But I've got numerous of Darwin's quotes peppered throughout, which explain his atheism. And he says, in my most extreme fluctuation, I've never been an atheist in the sense of denying the existence of God. Now, that's an early statement in 1866. Then his statements change down the line. But not always. An agnostic would be the most correct description of my state of mind, that he says, right? Remember, his grandfather was definitely a raving atheist, but also called himself an agnostic. And he says, during these 2 years, I was led to think much about religion. On board the Beagle, I was orthodox. And then he said, I suppose it was the novelty of the argument, right, that amused them, but I'd gradually come by this time to see that the Old Testament, from its manifestly false history of the world, with the Tower of Babel, rainbow as a sign, etc., and from its attributing to God the feelings of a revengeful tyrant, was no more to be trusted than the books of the Hindus or the beliefs of any barbarian. So the Bible is barbarian, but Darwin saying go kill your neighbor and take his stuffs, that's just all good. That's from Nora Barlow, the autobiography of Charles Darwin, and he says here that, and I came to view that scriptures were unreliable and contradictory, and that's the Annie hypothesis. So Darwin was by no means Christian. His theory was definitely anti-Christian. His agenda was to destroy the church and destroy the view of God. So there was Charles Kingsley who promoted Darwin, but he misunderstood Darwin, or he was duped, who knows. So he's used to shield Darwin against this charge of atheism. Now, we must understand this is Darwin is an atheist god, right, if you want to think of it that way. He used Kingsley's affirmation that in reading Darwin, he learned that natural selection allowed for a nobler concept of the deity, one who created primal forms capable of self-development. This guy was self-deluded. And he says here, Darwin himself, even though he thought it was nonsense, was willing to use Kingsley's words as yet another sop for those who didn't understand his denial of God. Let me fix my slide. I see I made another typo there. Keep doing this. And
listen, don't fix it. Just let it. Eventually, it will evolve into a slide with no typo.
You're right. In In the words of Darwin biographer Janet Brown, nothing could have been further from Darwin's intention than Kingsley's theistic spin. Natural selection was a phenomenon that could never be governed or set into motion by a creator. Kingsley had misunderstood that the main point of Darwin's book was to remove the creator from nature. And Darwin said so multiple times. I mean, I've quoted several of his quotes already. And Lyell, Wallace, and Gray, Darwin would not let the divine foot in the door. He had constant battles with these very much theologically inclined scientists. They argued that man's moral and intellectual abilities could not be explained by natural selection. This upset Darwin. To prove them wrong, he wrote The Descent of Man. He said that man's moral and intellectual capacities are brought about by natural selection, but also religion is brought about from natural selection. These are just still speculations, right? This was his final word on God. So now I'll finish off with Huxley. I'm not going too fast, am I? I'm giving sufficient detail.
That's great. We'll do another show too. You just finish off whenever you need to.
I'll probably need like 2 more to finish this. So, and I'm going at quite a pace here. So T.H. Huxley, from Devil's Disciple to Evolution's High Priest. So let's have a look at the Huxleys. So the author of this book here, okay, Adrian Desmond from Devil's Disciple, okay, he co-authored a previous biography of Darwin with James Moore, and he's one of the founders of the scientific skeptical sort of society of the 20th century, right? He was called Darwin's bulldog. He popularized Darwin's theories and also for his hatred of and war against theology. Now, he was a scientist. So evolution was intertwined with questions of belief and morals and ethics, and he was the foremost defender of Darwin's ideas in the English-speaking world. And he created this definite dichotomy of faith versus science. So he pushed this very, very hard. And the sickly, reclusive Darwin let the feisty but lower-class Huxley battle what he derided as theology and parsondom, which both saw as the irreconcilable enemies of science. Darwin felt that theology was the enemy of science, right? And so in the year of Darwin's Origin of Species, Huxley vowed that if he lived for 30 more years, he would see the foot of science on the necks of our enemies. That would be religion. Now, of course, Huxley was a huge critic. Now, what's odd is, though, that he was known as Darwin's bulldog. He fought tooth and nail in debates to promote this. But let's have a look. In a 1975 paper, and in another paper by Mario de Gregorio in 84, they pointed out that Huxley entertained serious doubts about the efficacy of natural selection. And for several years, he kept it out of his own work. He would not include it. Others have drawn attention to the fact that during the 40s and 50s, Huxley was a fierce critic of evolution who wrote the most savage of the many negative reviews of Robert Chambers' Vestiges. So he actually did not believe in evolution. He criticized natural selection, and yet he promoted it because he hated the church. Adrian Desmond's Archetypes and Ancestors highlights the dark side of Huxley's character. Scheming, opportunistic, no more saintly than Richard Owen. The Darwinian prophet of truth seems to have been the Machiavelli of the Victorian evolution debate. He used Darwinism to destroy religion and change the social order, not because he believed in Darwinism. And Thomas says, no rational man cognizant of the facts believes that the average Negro is the equal, still less the superior, of the white man. I'll do one more slide. So you can see that, and this is not contradicted by Darwin, was an out-and-out racist. I mean, let's be blunt. The man was, so rewriting nature. This is in the New Yorker. There's some quotes here by Darwin. Design was just chance plus time. Greed is not a sin from the devil, but an inheritance from monkeys. So there are no sins. And he goes on to say here, our descent then is the origin of our evil passions. He wrote, that's why he says the descent of man, it's the fall of man. And the devil, under form of baboon, is our grandfather. Yes, Darwin did say we're from baboons. That's Darwin. And Darwin was the most profound and successful challenge to dogmatic religious belief that had ever been launched. In one generation, it caused intelligent people to accept claims about history and man's place that had been considered heretical for thousands of years. He let other men, particularly his great friend of 30 years and champion T.H. Huxley, do the dirty work of polemics. He and Huxley played knowingly good cop, bad cop in public. They exchanged 30 years worth of letters. Okay, I'm not going to include all of it. There's a lot to be said here. Their correspondence shows that each knew his given role, and they would actually fight, but behind the scenes, they were actually collaborating.
It makes you wonder why people, Darwin seems like the most insufferable human being. I mean, he was obviously a very. I can't imagine he was much of a lively person to be around, being so sickly and depressed and morose. It just shows. It just shows what people are willing to do in order to advance some sort of sociological revolution.
Yeah. Yeah. So I wonder if I should. So I should probably just finish here. Oh,
Yeah, we'll just
Huxley, by
finish
the
here.
way, coined the word agnostic. He coined the word agnostic in 1869. Even though he was not an agnostic, he was an out and out anti-Christian. He hated the church and wanted to destroy religion, right? And he was attacking the dogma. So he created the term. To him, science was at war with theology, and he said that faith was contrary to the scientific method. So, and then of course you get his grandson T. Huxley, and of course this is another sick guy with constant medical and emotional issues. I'll stop here at this point.
Were they related to the? Were they related to Aldous Huxley? Whoops, where'd you go? Oh, Lloyd disappeared. I'll put him back in. There you are.
Oops, I accidentally disconnected myself. I meant to stop sharing my screen. Sorry,
That's
I'm
all
done.
right. It's all right. Your computer will evolve one day to not do that to you. But were they related to the Aldous Huxley? To the Huxley with the Brave New World?
Yes, they were related. Yeah.
Yeah.
Julian Huxley, because this was Julian Huxley I was going to
Huxley,
get to
sorry.
next.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
Yeah,
he
yeah.
himself had severe medical issues as well. So they were all little cuckoo. And we're supposed to regard them as great men.
Well, there you go. Well, Lloyd, this has been enlightening. Not in the enlightenment sense, because that was terrible, but in the actual sense of the word. So
Right.
we'll have you back on soon. Ladies and gentlemen, go to Lloyd's channel. You just look up Lloyd de Jongh. It's I believe I spelt it right in the description in the title today, if I'm not mistaken. So you look that up, and you can find more of his stuff there, more in depth. And anything you want to add before we sign off here? Some projects you got going on?
Yeah. I've just actually started. I've just opened up a store. People have been asking to buy for access to my presentation. Some of them run into like 190 pages, 150 pages. This one's going to end up being like 130. So I've just opened a store. I've made available my first two for sale, and I will also I provide notes for them, and for those who are interested in wanting to use this for their schools, their Sunday schools, whatever the case is, I will be making my archive of like 100 of these presentations available. They come with notes, they come with citations, they come with links to the resources, they come with the links to the books. So that will be available to those who are interested. And I will be doing video chats with people to want to ask questions about these so they can use them for themselves.
That's excellent. And everyone who's involved in apologetics, you should be looking into this stuff to disprove all this nonsense, especially in the Catholic Church, where a lot of these smart thinkers try to square the round peg of evolution, and there's even one organization that evangelizes through evolution and things like that, and it's just nonsense. All right. Ladies and gentlemen, as always, let me know what you think in the comments. Also, like this video, subscribe to this channel. I always forget to plug my own stuff. And check out the TKR store in the description to this video. You can check out my books as well. They're down there. And that's good. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we'll talk to you soon. And until next time, God bless.
God bless.